Zentralblatt für Okkultismus 1912-13 English Audiobook Edition Part 2 Translated from PDF pages 76 to 150 of the supplied scan. This is a lean English edition prepared for text-to-speech. It continues directly from Part 1. Running journal headers, page numbers, advertisements, subscription information, image captions, publisher addresses, and most bibliographic footnotes have been omitted. The principal articles are translated in full or nearly full form. Short news notices, book notices, and highly repetitive editorial matter are tightened while preserving their substantive claims. Because the source is an old image scan, occasional OCR uncertainty may remain. Historical, medical, racial, astrological, spiritualist, and occult claims are translated as historical source material, not presented as modern fact or advice. On the Trail of the Soul, by Paul Krojanker, continued from Part 1. Thompson writes that the more closely we observe the changes in human beings that connect matter and mind, the clearer it becomes that in the gradual development of the brain, the formative impulses do not come only from outside, but also from within, and that they differ essentially from the nature of the channels that conduct them. The conducting mechanism itself is inborn and does not require the conscious mind to set it in motion. To describe a personality that thinks, intends, and wills as merely automatic is, in his view, a contradiction. What then of people whose ordinary sensory perception is partly denied them, such as the blind and the deaf? Experience shows that other pathways can compensate for what has been lost, and that a rich inner life can nevertheless develop. The best-known example is the American Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf and yet developed an unusually rich intellectual life. Critics had attempted to dismiss parts of her story as exaggeration, but Professor William Sternfeld of Breslau reported an experiment he conducted during a visit to Keller. Sternfeld tested her receptivity to musical impressions. Keller leaned against the piano with one hand resting on the instrument, while he first played a simple melody with the rhythm sharply emphasized. She beat the time with substantial accuracy and called it a soldier's march. He then played the familiar Blue Danube waltz. Keller became visibly excited. Her body began to vibrate and sway. Sternfeld believed these movements were so spontaneous and forceful that imagined pleasure could be ruled out. She described the piece as a country dance. Chopin's funeral march followed, and Keller became quiet and solemn. Sternfeld concluded that his visit was not only among his most interesting experiences, but among the most humanly beautiful and enriching. Whoever had seen the quiet house, the harmonious and cultivated life of its inhabitants, Keller's sunny personality, and the ideal friendship between Keller and her former teacher, he said, would understand how groundless the petty doubts and attacks upon her were. The author says these questions are not merely theoretical. Their laws can be applied to active life. What takes place in the soul is not indifferent to bodily health, and the movements of the soul depend in part upon the thoughts and images formed by the mind. The powers of mind and soul therefore ought to be brought under the direction of the will. Mental hygiene is as necessary as physical hygiene. A healthy life of mind and feeling acts in this view as a liberating and rejuvenating influence upon the organism, and helps preserve its ability to function. The mind should continually receive fresh impressions, and the soul should be elevated by works of genius in poetry, art, science, and religion, just as the body requires daily food. Religion is included because, according to Krojanker, the inner core of religion has an enduring content. In its deepest sense, religion is not something merely imposed upon a person from without. It springs from needs of mind and soul, and expresses a striving within the unconscious, whose destination we do not yet fully know. Modern life, he continues, tends to narrow the mental horizon in every social class. Most people move within fixed tracks of thought until the movements of the soul become partly automatic. Courage and joy in life would not dry up so easily if, in addition to professional work, everyone cultivated some other serious interest. Ideals must form a stable foundation for human striving, and such pursuits also provide the best rest for the brain. The brain's development does not end when bodily growth ends. The mind can continually carve new paths into it. The anatomist Hirt is cited for the idea that repeated individual practice can turn ideas and entire systems of memory into reflexes, creating anatomical dispositions in the brain which may be strengthened across generations. Older dispositions, he argued, require repeated counter-training when they favor ideas hostile to newly acquired ones. Krojanker summarizes the principle in the phrase, "Thoughts are the building stones of the brain." He then quotes a saying attributed to the Vedas, "As a man thinks today, so he will be tomorrow. Man is a product of his thoughts." Self-knowledge thus opens new paths for what the author calls the culture of the soul. Growth of the inner life, spiritual renewal, and strength of soul and body depend upon recognizing a spiritual center in the human being that remains unchanged even when outward reason becomes ill and the soul suffers. We experience this center, he says, in the feeling of the self. He quotes Ruckert in Substance. "One may doubt a thing, what it is, or whether it exists, but one cannot so easily doubt one's own self." Let certainty of the self be the starting point from which knowledge proceeds. Rudolf Eucken is then invoked. Eucken had argued that immersion in immediate existence by itself does not give life sufficient content. Behind the visible life remains a depth-seeking satisfaction. If the spiritual world supplies this substance, then the human being must seek his true nature there. The movement toward it is not an endless outward expansion, but a turning inward, an attainment of one's own essence. The ideal is therefore not located in some remote external realm, but within the proper sphere of human existence, in the relation of a person to the inwardly present spiritual world as his own true being. Metaphysics, Krojanker concludes, need not contradict physiological research. It can continue beyond it. Physiology is right to say that intellectual activity depends upon the condition of the brain. But the soul, he argues, stands to the brain as an artist stands to an instrument. Metaphysics seeks to demonstrate a transcendental core of the human being and the independent existence of the soul. It may help tear down the walls separating the sciences. Then perhaps, as Claude Bernard once hoped, the physiologist, the poet, and the philosopher will speak the same language and meet one another. Further postmortem statements of W.T. Stead by Ludwig Deinhard. In an earlier article on the death of W.T. Stead, the journal reproduced several communications obtained through mediums which appeared, from their contents, to come from victims of the Titanic disaster, including Stead. The London spiritualist journal Light later published additional material that Deinhard says may, if one chooses, be regarded as postmortem statements by Stead. One such communication appeared in the May 18 issue. It had been received by James Robertson of Glasgow through automatic writing and was attributed to Stead. The communication begins by saying that it now gives him extraordinary satisfaction to know that a person who has passed through the gate of death can continue to communicate with those left behind. He had believed this possible while alive, but changing from the role of receiver to that of transmitter had surprised him and made many things intelligible that he had not understood in earthly life. The speaker says he has become convinced that the possibility of transmitting messages is far greater than either people still in the physical world or his companions in the other world have yet realized. Instead of trying to control a single medium or instrument, thoughts should be sent out energetically in every direction like wireless telegrams so that many receptive minds can receive them at once. He intends to experiment in this direction and to learn from failures as well as successes. Much of his first work, the message continues, concerned those who had passed through the Titanic catastrophe with him but remained blind to their new surroundings. He had to help them understand where they were. People with whom he had spoken aboard ship about survival after death now had to realize that those conversations had not concerned fantasies but realities. Some remained resistant for a long time, others understood immediately. Those who had never considered the possibility that after death we remain fundamentally the same persons as before became deeply confused. No church can save a man from himself, the communication declares. Nature has imprinted upon the whole being of a person the history of his life, good and bad deeds, hidden inclinations, whether or not they ever came outwardly to expression. The chapters of that history can be read, it says, by anyone whose spiritual sight has been sharpened. The supposed Stead says that his own condition causes him little difficulty because he carried the necessary understanding with him. His concern is with the ignorant and suffering, especially those who had lived selfishly on earth. Pity for others' suffering is natural to the human being, he says, and he exerted his whole will toward helping until he saw many of them placed in the care of people who possessed clearer insight and felt compelled to assist relatives and friends. At times he wishes he had survived the disaster in the flesh, so that his pen could have given an exact account of the heroic courage that awakened among men and women who had never suspected themselves capable of it. The others first, and there is no hurry about me, were words he says he heard repeatedly. He describes the scene as magnificent, and says he silently thanked God that humanity had been endowed with such dignity. Although he still had much work to do on earth, the message says, he accepted his fate cheerfully, because the disaster would probably make future sea travel far safer. He had been proud of the great ship, of the precision of its details and the grandeur of the whole. It was a monumental product of the restless human mind, a forerunner of still greater things. Until humanity fully understands the forces of nature, however, those forces will sometimes crush even its finest works. The communication then returns to Stead's old mission, relieving humanity of the despair produced by living without certainty about survival. Had he returned to London, he had intended to make the certainty he believed he had acquired available to others. That chapter, he says, is closed. Now he must work with others who continually search for openings for which something may be sent into the earthly world. He claims to have gathered around him a number of missionaries and hopes that people still on earth who have pure and noble intentions will cooperate. They will continually send out messages and look for people in whom psychic powers are beginning to germinate. No spiritual worker, the communication says, can meet the highest demands unless the work aims at improving others and rests upon genuine belief in God. The moral qualities of mediums, therefore, matter greatly. On arriving in the other world, the speaker says he himself needed help and received it freely. His burning desire now is to open the eyes of the blind so that they can perceive the power and joy available to them. He is convinced that the gradual opening of these gates serves a great purpose, the fuller development and spiritualization of humanity. Every spiritualist, he concludes, should understand this work as a form of elevation and recognize that the salvation of one's own soul requires continual work upon it until purity, peace, and confidence arise. Dinehard does not attempt a detailed psychological analysis. Such an analysis, he says, would require close knowledge both of the medium James Robertson, whom he did not know, and of Stead, whom he had known only briefly. He therefore asks readers to let the communication stand on its own and judge for themselves whether its tone agrees with the portrait of Stead drawn in the journal's July issue. The Influence of the Planets on People at Different Stages of Development, by Max Lucke. Lucke opens with Goethe's lines, describing the human being as developing according to the law under which one entered the world, with sun and planets standing in a particular relation at birth. Goethe, he says, shows here as elsewhere that although he was familiar with many branches of knowledge, he did not swear allegiance to materialistic science alone, but also allowed a place for occult science. The influence of planetary radiations and of the sun and moon has in the author's view been recognized in every age, even when only by a few. Just as months are associated with signs of the zodiac, years are said to stand under particular planets. Lucke does not say that people have a certain character simply because they were born in a particular planetary year. To avoid confusing cause and effect, he argues that they were born under that yearly planet because causes laid down in former earthly lives brought them into that condition. The birth year may therefore offer clues to a present life. This does not mean that the other planets have no influence. All are said to act upon the person, but the ruler of the year acts especially strongly. Lucke also notes that in his system, the astrological year begins on March 22nd rather than January 1st. So, dates from January 1st through March 21st belong to the preceding astrological year. He gives the planetary correspondences used in his system. Jupiter corresponds to Atma, blue and tin. Mercury corresponds to Buddy, yellow and mercury. Venus corresponds to Buddy Manas, indigo and copper. Saturn corresponds to Kama Manas, green and lead. Mars corresponds to Kama, red and iron. The moon corresponds to the astral plane, violet and silver. The sun corresponds to Prana, orange and gold. The influence of Uranus and Neptune, he says, had not yet been fully understood and was supposedly imperceptible to many contemporaries, because they were not spiritually fine enough to respond to radiation from such distant planets. From these correspondences, Lucke divides civilized humanity into 7 broad groups, each corresponding to one of the 7 planets, but appearing very differently depending upon whether a person lives primarily in the material, intellectual, or spiritual sphere. Someone born in a Jupiter year who lives almost entirely materially might, he says, stand spiritually lower than someone born under the moon who works for the interests of the whole community. Most ordinary people in his scheme live mainly in the material sphere, and to a lesser degree in the intellectual. Those farther developed are less materially centered and more intellectually or spiritually striving. Only a small number, he says, have nearly overcome the material and live chiefly in the intellectual and spiritual. Jupiter's nature is represented by tin, the soldering metal that joins separate things. Jupiter therefore symbolizes union, repose, and inner balance. At the lowest level, this becomes dull indifference or thick-skinned unconcern. A person cares little what unpleasant things others say or think, so long as his purpose is attained. At the intellectual level, Jupiter produces the practical, reasonable person who does only what appears useful and purposeful, values art and fairy tales little, cares less for beautiful form than for utility, and judges people chiefly by whether they can be intellectually useful. At the highest level, Jupiter corresponds to nirvana and to contentment with one's fate, including the capacity to discover a good side, even in apparently bad circumstances. A spiritually Jupiterian person, Lucke says, cannot envy others, because his own conditions suffice. If he seeks improvement, he does so calmly and without passion. Mercury is represented by quicksilver, suggesting rapid movement of thought and sharpness of mind. On the material plane, this creates the clever merchant who knows how to secure an advantage in every situation, even at another's expense. Lucke cites Shakespeare's Shylock as a literary example, using the anti-Semitic language and stereotypes common to the period. On the intellectual plane, Mercury appears as intelligence across many fields, power of mental concentration, and skill in science and craftsmanship. On the spiritual plane, Mercury leads in this scheme toward direct recognition of truth, the understanding that spirit rules form rather than form ruling spirit, and an intuition said to outshine ordinary earthly knowledge. Venus governs feeling. At a strongly material level, the Venus type is devoted to sexual love, whether within or outside marriage. The author connects this with the Venusberg of Tannhauser and with the Roman goddess Venus. But Venus also represents love of beauty. Artistic natures are therefore said to come under her influence. Music, painting, poetry, sculpture, architecture, dance, and artistic dress. Copper and bronze are assigned to Venus because of their long use in artistic statues and engraving. Spiritually inclined Venus types care about the intellectual and spiritual welfare, enlightenment, and progress of others. They are said to be able to restrict or renounce their own wishes for another person's benefit. Saturn. At the material level, Saturn produces people who anxiously collect earthly goods, especially money. Thrift becomes pettiness, miserliness, and in extreme cases a hoarding so strong that the author imagines the dead miser's astral or etheric body still circling a buried treasure. Lead, the heavy and difficult-to-move metal, symbolizes this quality. Intellectually, Saturn appears as dogmatism. Lucke associates it with the lower mental plane, kama manas. Such people, he says, confuse external forms with inner essence, fall into sophistry, and demand intellectual or visible proof, even where a clearer mind would find something logically evident. At a higher spiritual level, the same one-sidedness can appear among people who have reached a wider worldview through spiritualism, mesmerism, magnetism, or hypnotism, but then treat one branch of occult science as the only saving truth. They forget, he says, that some people may have worked with such subjects in previous lives and need not repeat the same experiences in the present one. Mars is the planet of desire and passion, but also of bodily strength, energy, and action. Iron corresponds to it, and the expression "an iron will" is cited as an example. War likewise falls under Mars through iron. Among materially oriented people, Lucke connects Mars with erotic sensuality, and in the prejudiced language of the period, with sexual practices he regarded as signs of cultural decline. Among more educated people, Mars produces the pursuit of physical power, beauty, strength, and health, sometimes chiefly so that the individual may live longer and enjoy life more. He includes among this group people who adopt vegetarianism only for personal bodily benefit rather than moral reasons. At a more altruistic level, Mars produces reformers who see the future salvation of humanity primarily in physical culture and bodily improvement, often while remaining skeptical of spiritual progress. The Moon. Silver is the Moon's metal because its appearance resembles moonlight, and because silver coinage can substitute for gold, just as the Moon is described as a reflection of the Sun. As a dead celestial body from which in the author's occult cosmology the spirit has departed, the Moon represents the reflection of spirit in the physical world, imagination, and the lower intellect acting without spiritual guidance. Materially oriented moon types are said to pursue their own material welfare energetically and to intensify competition, pleasure-seeking, card and dice games, racing, and gambling. Intellectual moon types represent ordinary rational knowledge that recognizes only the physical as real and smiles at anything spiritual. Lucke includes many contemporary scholars in this category. At the altruistic level, the Moon's concern for material life is directed toward others. Sickness funds, workers' pensions, care of widows and orphans, accident insurance, life insurance, fire and hail insurance, burglary insurance, and similar institutions serving the public. The Sun. Gold corresponds to the sun. Lucke notes the yellow color associated with sunlight and with various medicines of his day. As creator and sustainer of earthly life, the sun governs joy and pleasure, though these appear differently at different levels. Very material sun types love dancing, music, theater, festivals, and entertainment simply as ways of passing the time. More intellectual sun types prefer the finer pleasures of literature, humor, satire, and criticism, and may enjoy becoming the center of literary or artistic circles, the sun around which others revolve. Spiritually striving sun types take an interest in the spiritual development of humanity and of the cosmos. They try to live at peace with others, relieve sorrow, and dispel unpleasantness by encouragement. These are the sunny dispositions who spread light around them, often without knowing it, and whose company is eagerly sought. Lucke concludes that no one is made good merely by being born under one of the supposedly spiritual planets, Jupiter, Mercury, or Venus. A person under Saturn, Mars, the Moon, or the Sun may also become good by developing the higher side of the influence. As with temperament, perfection comes not from being ruled by one influence, but from cultivating the best side of all of them. The spiritually striving person may eventually outgrow planetary influences and rule the stars in his breast instead of being ruled by them. He closes with the astrological maxim, "The stars incline, but they do not compel." Immunity to Fire by Wilhelm Wrchovszky. One of the strangest phenomena reported among many peoples and in many periods, Rakovski says, is apparent invulnerability to fire. In recent decades, he claims, The phenomenon had repeatedly been observed under conditions that convinced serious investigators that something real demanded explanation, although no adequate theory had yet been found. Karl Duprel collected accounts extending over some 2,000 years in his Mysticism of the Ancient Greeks and Studies in the Field of the Occult Sciences, and regarded the problem of fire immunity as one for natural science to solve. Baudy de Vesme and Professor Purdy, especially in connection with phenomena reported around the Scottish medium D.D. Home and witnessed by William Crookes and others, entertained the hypothesis that spirits acting through fluidic currents might be involved. Andrew Lang proposed no definite theory, but rejected ordinary explanations such as collective hallucination, chemical protectives, or unusually calloused feet as inadequate, leaving suggestion as a possibility. Hassarge had likewise wondered whether highly hysterical individuals might temporarily become resistant through autosuggestion, perhaps by intense evaporation of perspiration, somewhat like the Leidenfrost effect. Rakovski responds that hysteria can hardly explain every firewalker, and in some reports the supposed protection was transmitted to other people. He suggests that cautious hypnotic experiments might someday test whether suggestion can affect resistance to fire. Yet to explain a phenomenon by suggestion, he adds, is almost merely to admit that the psyche has produced an effect whose mechanism remains unexplained. K. de Jong treated the subject in his work on the Ancient Mysteries, linking fire immunity with Egyptian and Greek initiations, particularly the famous passage in Apuleius about passing through the elements. Percival Lowell, the American astronomer and student of Japan, had also described Japanese firewalking, hiwatari. Rakovski then turns to cases he regarded as among the best attested of modern times. D.D. Home and glowing coals. Professor Purdy, drawing upon the English journal Human Nature of December 1868, reported that the medium Daniel Douglas Home held glowing coals in his hand for 3 or 4 minutes without blackening the skin. Home was also said to have placed his face into the fire while flames played around his hair, then withdrawn it, and remarked that not a hair on his head had been burned. In another demonstration, Home approached a lord and offered to place a glowing coal in his hand if he were not afraid. The reporter Jenkin tried first, touched the coal only briefly on its black side, and burned his finger. Home then placed the whole glowing coal in the lord's hand, closed the lord's other hand over it, and pressed both hands together around the coal. The backs of the hands reportedly felt intensely hot, yet after 2 minutes there was no visible burn. Home supposedly refused to give coals to people who did not have faith, saying they would burn themselves. A glowing coal normally caused paper to burst into flame, but when Home wished, it was reported that he could leave one upon a sheet of newspaper for several minutes without igniting it. Purdy compared this with demonstrations in which a wet hand can briefly enter molten metal because extreme heat rapidly forms a protective layer of vapor. He considered the comparison insufficient, however, because the heat of a coal was not high enough to produce such a strong vapor envelope, and because the newspaper, unlike a wet hand, was also reportedly protected while Home was in trance. Firewalking in China. De Jong cited an account by the missionary G. Ziegler concerning firewalking by Buddhist priests during the nocturnal Taoxiao festival in China. Roughly 700 pieces of charcoal, and in some cases 2,000 or 3,000, were spread in a layer and brought to a glow. Salt was sometimes scattered over the fire to reduce its intensity, though this was not universal. The bed of coals, which could otherwise flame to a man's height, remained about a foot deep. Bricks lay among the coals, and were assumed to be intensely heated as well. The priest acting as master of ceremonies, not every priest knew the art, was said to place a duck and a chicken into the glowing bed before the spectators without singeing their feathers. He then held a small glowing pan between his teeth, carried a knife in one hand, balanced a heated brick upon the other, and invited others to follow him through the fire. No one ventured onto it before the priest, but afterward men and children followed and reportedly escaped injury. Ziegler mentioned one priest, years earlier, who slipped in crossing and was burned because he could not rise immediately. According to the missionary, Christians who had attended the ceremony before their conversion insisted that it had not been a fraud. A former Buddhist priest whom he later baptized made the same assertion. Rakovski argues that converted participants, and especially an ex-priest, would have little reason to conceal tricks or protective devices if such things had really been used. The Fiji Firewalk. The author next turns to Andrew Lang's accounts of a similar ceremony in Fiji, drawing especially upon the observations of Dr. Haken. The participants belonged to the Nagalita clan and walked over a glowing bed of stones about 15 feet across. Their leader remained in the fire area for nearly half a minute. Before the ceremony, a thermometer held 5 or 6 feet above the heated stones had to be withdrawn almost immediately because its solder began to melt and the instrument appeared in danger of bursting. It registered 282 degrees Fahrenheit, well above the boiling point of water. Immediately before the ceremony, Haken obtained permission to examine 2 of the firewalkers. The district's leading indigenous official, Ndabea, commonly known as Jonathan, readily granted permission. Jonathan himself belonged to the Nagalita clan and had crossed the fire repeatedly, though on this occasion he supervised rather than participated. The 2 men showed nothing unusual. With garlands around neck and waist, their pulses were quiet. Haken could detect no protective substance on skin, legs, or feet, and says he tested this by touching, smelling, and even tasting the surfaces. Their soles were comparatively soft and flexible, not leathery or insensitive. He repeated the examination immediately after they came from the fire, with the same result. To use the biblical phrase, he said, the smell of fire had not passed on them, yet he could not discover the essential cause. When asked for an explanation, local people merely shrugged. They can do these wonderful things, we cannot. You have seen it, we have seen it. Haken therefore proposed no theory, but stated that he was convinced both of the reality of what he had witnessed and of the firewalker's honesty. One peculiarity, he observed, was that wherever this power occurred, it seemed confined to a limited number of people. He was also assured that any person firmly holding the hand of a firewalker could cross unharmed. The islanders maintained this confidently. Walter Carew, a friend of Hawkins who had spent 30 years as a resident commissioner and salaried official in Fiji, had repeatedly questioned Jonathan. Jonathan did not refuse to explain. Rather, he said he simply could not. I can do it, but I do not know how it happens, he reportedly said, adding that while crossing, he felt neither heat nor any other sensation. Haken concluded that some alleged fire miracles can easily be explained by protective preparations, but that such explanations did not seem sufficient for the observations described here. He therefore considered the whole subject worthy of careful scientific investigation. The Rosicrucians, by Nemo. This article is written as a dialogue between 2 readers discussing Hargrave Jennings's 2-volume German edition. The Rosicrucians, Their Rites and Mysteries. A begins by praising the work as magnificent. B immediately qualifies the praise. The physical production is excellent, he says, and the roughly 300 illustrations and 12 plates are often highly instructive. But the title promises more than the author actually delivers. How can the book be called The Rosicrucians, B asks, when it speaks at length about the English Rosicrucian Robert Fludd, but gives very little coherent treatment of the German Rosicrucians from whom Fludd supposedly inherited much? The reader learns little in an organized way about Rosicrucian rites and mysteries, while being given a great deal of curious material: King Arthur's Round Table, the origin of the Order of the Garter, the French lilies, and other subjects that may be interesting in themselves, but have little direct relation to Rosicrucianism. A admits that Jennings often mixes unrelated matters and repeatedly strays from his path. B then complains that some occult and theosophical circles look down upon German scholarship because they find the slow, cautious method of German researchers tiresome. Yet, he argues, a careful historical scholar could have begun with Fludd and led the reader backward to Michael Meyer, physician to Emperor Rudolph II, who traveled to England around 1620, helped prepare the ground for Rosicrucian ideas there, and found in Flood one of the most enthusiastic followers. Such a scholar, B continues, would have examined Maier's writings, at least his 1617 defense of the Rosicrucians, Silentium post clamores, in order to clarify the relation between Maier and Flood and possible dependence of Flood upon him. He would also have examined the thinkers upon whose shoulders Maier stood, including the figures whom Kiesewetter, in his History of Modern Occultism, called Paracelsists. This would raise more fundamental questions. Was Paracelsus himself a Rosicrucian? Who can properly be called a genuine Rosicrucian? What historical evidence exists? Johann Valentin Andreae would also need fuller treatment. Jennings, B complains, gives him only a few lines. In literary history, Andreae was often described as a satirist who invented the Rosicrucian manifestos partly to mock the occult enthusiasms and secret societies of his age. Yet the movement that followed became real enough, whether or not satire helped launch it. B says a truly adequate history would trace the Rosicrucians from their still obscure beginnings and investigate their rites and mysteries as far as possible, including possible relations with Kabbalists, Gnostics, and Templars on one side, and Illuminati and Freemasons on the other. Jennings does offer valuable hints, but the amount of material is so great that the guiding thread often slips from his hands. B, nevertheless, defends Jennings in one respect. Jennings began his research around 1850, and after some 36 years of study, completed the work about 1886. Kiesewetter's first edition did not appear until 1891. Jennings therefore lacked many of the research aids available to later writers, and cannot fairly be blamed for failing to use scholarship that did not yet exist. The dialogue then turns to what B calls one of Jennings's basic ideas. Jennings considered the phallus, or the paired symbols of linga and yoni, the key to every cult in the world. B grants that sexual symbolism is indeed a key to countless practices, wonderful and strange, profound and noble, as well as degraded, but insists, with Blavatsky, that magic cannot be unlocked with only one key. B develops an alternative symbolic reading. If the upright line, tube, cylinder, or pillar is treated as a symbol of the generative masculine principle, and the circle, sphere, egg, or hollow form as the receptive feminine principle, then these shapes appear not merely in the sexual organs, but repeatedly throughout the human body. The spinal column is an upright structure, ending in the rounded skull and brain case. Together, they create movement and sensation. The windpipe is another tube connected with the hollow cavity of the mouth, together producing the spoken word, and the word, B notes, has enormous importance in magical traditions. He adds that the pineal body and the pituitary region were compared by some older anatomists to similarly paired forms, and that the pineal gland had itself been treated by occultists as an organ related to knowledge of higher worlds. He then plays with elemental correspondences. Through the sexual organ comes bodily seed, associated with earth and water. Through the windpipe comes air. Through the spinal column comes a non-luminous fire, compared with the electrical or alchemical fire. And through the pineal region, perhaps the quinta essentia, or the Indian serpent fire. B repeatedly cautions, however, that symbolic schemes of this kind can easily become arbitrary and lead researchers astray. If one ventures still farther into the invisible world, he suggests, the entire human being may be imagined as the upright principle, while the surrounding astral or subtle envelopes form an egg-shaped receptive field, the auric egg of seers. If ancient and medieval magicians really possess the high knowledge of human nature attributed to them, B concludes, they cannot have stopped at crude sexual symbolism. The linga and yoni may symbolize the creative and created powers of nature, but for initiates, they would also have signified deeper and more comprehensive truths. The Rosicrucians, he says, were unlikely to have been an exception. Attempts to establish a scientific experimental magic by Dr. L. Staudenmaier, professor of experimental chemistry at the Royal Lyceum in Freising, now asks how the demonstrations that seem partly or completely independent of his conscious will are to be explained. From a histological standpoint, he says, the human body can be regarded as an aggregate of an enormous number of cells, individual building stones differing in structure and degree of development. Yet these are not dead building stones, they are living cells of many kinds, and he proposes that the human organism contains an immense abundance of forms of animal and higher psychic existence. He believes the terms idea, representation, and thinking are usually interpreted either too abstractly by philosophy or too mechanically by materialism, as if they were merely excitations of rows of cells in the cerebral cortex. In his own theory, the more highly developed cells and cell complexes of the cortex that become excited when the conscious ego thinks are themselves living entities that participate psychically, in greater or lesser degree, in the activity of the conscious ego. When he thinks, for example, of the German emperor, the cells that play the principal role in his personification called highness become active and try to develop and clarify the pleasant idea suggested to them, until the conscious ego interrupts the process. Such cells, he says, have been trained for particular one-sided purposes and assigned fixed positions in the organism, yet still possess a certain separate existence. Their specialized duties give them a specialized memory and specialized interests that do not necessarily coincide with the interests of the conscious self. In nervous individuals, these subordinate systems may, because they are capable of affects and moods, gain a remarkable influence over the emotional state and over the life and actions of the conscious ego. Because they can learn, Staudenmaier believes they may eventually develop into something like intelligent partial beings with which the conscious personality must seriously reckon. He offers an example involving his personification Highness. After he had repeatedly visited a certain city, Highness urged him to go there again. Staudenmaier replied that there was no need, because he had already seen everything important. The inner voice asked, "Do you really know of nothing important left?" He thought and answered no. The reply came unexpectedly. The residence. This suggestion, he says, was entirely characteristic of Highness, and shortly afterward he followed the advice and visited the royal residence. His personifications also try, he says, to question him secretly and press their own ideas upon him. They may want to know what he plans to do the next day, or whether he intends to take a long walk or excursion. Suddenly he finds himself thinking, "Tomorrow I must do this and that. Perhaps it would be good to take a longer walk. The weather will probably be favorable, and I have time." Often, without intending or even noticing it, he whispers the thought, or speaks it hallucinatorily, which allows the personifications to hear what he is thinking. If he then listens inwardly, he may catch the familiar voice of one of them, whispering hallucinatorily, and recognize that the whole train of thought had been suggested by that personification. Much of the thinking, he concludes, becomes a silent dialogue, a back-and-forth questioning among himself, the personification, and other personified or non-personified centers drawn involuntarily into the discussion. He sometimes observes two or more personifications cooperating to help him, or secretly communicating by faint hallucinatory speech in order to fight or annoy the old man, the nickname they have given him. He compares this with telegraph operators within a complicated network who can communicate among themselves without the knowledge of the other stations. At other times, the personifications quarrel with and insult one another. These personifications are frequently incomplete. He may hear alternating voices, such as the child's voice and the voice of Highness, while visual hallucinations recede. Or he may see a personification while hearing its voice internally, rather than as sound proceeding from the visible figure. A complete personification, he reasons, requires the cooperation of a larger number of cells and centers, some of which may at that moment be occupied with other tasks or insufficiently energized. Their intelligence also varies enormously from moment to moment. Certain associations may temporarily become difficult or impossible, especially while Staudenmaier himself is thinking intensely and using wide areas of the brain for his own purposes. He compares this to the fact that even the conscious ego is not equally capable of thought at all times. The absence of such striking experiences in an ordinary person, he argues, does not refute his theory. Digestion, regulation of the blood supply, the development of organs and bodily form, and the maintenance of that form all proceed largely without the conscious ego's knowledge or cooperation. Why, then, should simpler psychophysical and even psychic functions not likewise take place without conscious awareness? An individual brain cell may play only a small role, but the cortex itself is not a homogeneous mass. It has an organized structure and distinguishable regions. Cells in a particular region receive broadly similar impressions, and, through common feeling and striving, may acquire a specialized function. Because thinking repeatedly employs the same or related ideas, cells and cell complexes that participate in a particular idea can become accustomed to working together, even when they are not immediately adjacent. This cooperation becomes especially strong when an idea is pleasant or emotionally important. Just as the conscious ego likes to return to a beloved person, a beautiful painting, or a beautiful landscape, the cells of the unconscious may also return to what pleases them. During one exercise in acute listening, Staudenmaier says, an inner voice told him, "We want to sound beautiful." If you want to train your hearing, you must listen to music. In suitably disposed people who love solitude, he therefore considers it possible that particular ideas may, through systematic cultivation, develop into full personifications. Their form will differ according to temperament, practice, and education. Ordinary, unsystematic attempts usually produce little because too many ideas compete for energy. The possible number of ideas is practically infinite. Just as the limitless variety of the outer world can be projected into the mind through perception, theoretically, the mind can reproduce its contents inwardly and project them outward again. But the greater the number of ideas one permits to compete, the less influence each individual idea possesses. A specialist in science, art, or music likewise works principally with a limited group of specialized representations. The deeper cultivation of a particular set of ideas into actual personifications requires devotion, time, and even a particular way of life. The number of strongly developed personifications must therefore remain limited. Staudenmaier argues that the more highly developed complexes of the unconscious may become genuine intelligences, especially when they attain greater independence. He points to the cunning actions sometimes observed in mental illness, and to intellectual achievements in dreams. Poets, mathematicians, preachers, and speakers have sometimes produced remarkable work while dreaming. He gives the example of an acquaintance who, as a schoolboy, had been unable to solve a difficult mathematical problem before going to bed. He went to sleep while still brooding over it, and dreamed a solution. On waking, he remembered it, wrote it down, and later found that it was correct. This suggests to Staudenmaier that in a normal person, some parts of the brain may remain awake and psychically active within a specialized field, while the rest sleeps, lies in lethargy, or has restricted associative ability. Such a part may even express things opposed to the waking personality. A trustworthy young woman told him, for example, that she often talked aloud in her sleep. A sister in the same room would sometimes use the opportunity to begin a conversation and successfully question her about personal secrets she would not have revealed while awake. Similar effects, he notes, are known in hypnosis. Even while fully awake, the activity of individual brain regions may sometimes become perceptible without the person being considered pathological. A melody may remain in one's head for days and repeatedly return against one's will. A phrase may recur whenever attention relaxes until conscious inhibition is restored. From here, Staudenmaier says, it is not a large step to imagine the relevant regions themselves singing or speaking. This occurs most often in dreams, where it is difficult to determine how much the conscious ego participates. There are many intermediate stages between the comparatively unified normal personality and extreme pathological fragmentation in which particular brain regions appear almost emancipated. In some cases, these regions may produce hallucinatory speech while the person is fully awake and otherwise fairly normal. to the inexperienced individual, such an inner voice necessarily gives the impression of a mysterious, invisible, and completely foreign personality. This is why inner voices have been regarded, since antiquity, as divine or demonic, according to their character. Staudenmaier finds it significant that Saint Teresa of Avila, more than 3 centuries earlier, had already recognized that an inner voice need not always be divine, diabolical, or a spirit. She warned that one must be experienced in order to distinguish words coming from a good spirit, an evil spirit, or one's own imagination, and wrote that the mind may in fact speak with itself. Such voices, he says, tend to appear when a person is deeply emotionally moved, stands before an important decision, is about to perform a great deed or a terrible crime, or suffers an illness that causes nervous excitation to radiate into normally quiet centers. The voice may therefore be good or evil, friendly or hostile, praising or accusing, warning, commanding or threatening, depending on the centers excited. The unconscious centers can create not only auditory but also visual hallucinations, especially in dreams, where images may appear more vivid, exact, and natural than anything the waking person can deliberately imagine. Automatic writing and the unconscious. Staudenmaier next returns to magical writing. In his earlier discussion, he had described learning to produce writing by conscious magical effort. Spiritistic automatic writing differs, he says, mainly because the principal activity is surrendered to relevant regions of the unconscious. One holds a pencil and vividly wishes or thinks that spirits should come and write. This involuntarily excites the brain regions associated with ideas of spirits, until those regions succeed, more or less well, in using the hand and expressing themselves. The conscious ego remains passive and expectant, while the corresponding parts of the unconscious gain independence. If one watches carefully, he says, one can distinctly feel the current of energy increasingly flowing into the hand. Only this time, the spirits perform the innervation. By the same principle, not only spirit writing but appearances of spirits, rapping sounds, and movement of objects may be produced. The unconscious can therefore practice magic in much the same way that he had previously described the conscious ego doing it. Again, the inexperienced observer would naturally believe that completely foreign beings are involved. Significant phenomena, however, require special predisposition. In spiritualist language, one must be a medium. Great diligence alone will not make someone a great medium, any more than diligence alone will make someone a true musical artist without aptitude. Staudenmaier recalls that an inner voice once asked permission to use his hand in order to learn drawing. All he needed to do, the voice said, was hold the pencil and allow the being to guide it. The being itself was the artist and possessed genius in that field. Spiritist literature, he remarks, contains many claims of artistic spirits. His theoretical explanation is that certain brain cells are predominantly visual and may be far more sensitive than the conscious ego within their narrow special domain. If they could gain means of expression, they might excel in form, color, and artistic visual imagination, and produce what appears to be genius in drawing. Something similar, he says, is known among poets. Verses sometimes arrive without deliberate thought, so that the unconscious rather than the conscious self seems to be the true poet. He quotes Schiller's poem, The Count of Habsburg, in which the singer is said to obey a higher master and the commanding hour, his song rising from hidden depths as a spring rises from the earth or the storm wind sweeps through the air. Usually, however, conscious and unconscious activity become so accustomed to cooperating that their work merges and the complexity of the process disappears from awareness, particularly in ordinary daily performance. This installment ends here. Staudenmaier's concluding installment appears later in Part 2. Tried Remedies for Snakebite and the Bite of Rabid Animals, collected and communicated by G.W. Surya. Continuation. The narrative resumes with a man who had been bitten by a snake and was believed to be dying. A messenger had run ahead to summon a local snake charmer and had told the occupants of a hut what had happened. By the time the party arrived, a bed had already been prepared for the injured man in the hut's single room. The narrator applied cooling compresses in an attempt to reduce the fever. The bite itself was small and bluish, but the surrounding tissue was badly swollen. The poison seemed already to have spread through the body. The patient found even the slightest touch painful, his forehead burned, and repeated chills shook him. The narrator gave him a little cold tea and sat at the foot of the bed through anxious minutes of silence, broken only by groans. He felt condemned to watch a dear friend die before his eyes. Human help, he believed, could do nothing. The man's condition worsened from minute to minute. His brown face became pale yellow, and his breathing took on a dull, rattling sound. When the narrator bent down to hear him, the patient whispered, "You have been a good and unselfish friend to me. I must leave you now, if he does not come soon. Give my greetings to my wife, and keep my rifle as a remembrance." The narrator could not answer, and could only squeeze his hand. The dying man was still thinking of the snake charmer, while the narrator inwardly regarded the expected ritual as a useless performance. After another long quarter hour, the sound of a galloping horse interrupted his thoughts. A tall, gaunt man dismounted, handed the reins to a resident of the hut, and advanced slowly and with great dignity. He seemed all skin and bone. A long projecting nose gave his narrow face a bird of prey appearance. Hair hung disorderly from beneath his turban, and his deep-set eyes had an extraordinarily piercing expression. The narrator reluctantly allowed him into the room, and determined to watch every movement and never leave him alone with his friend. Once inside, he understood why the local people treated the man with fearful respect. His features looked hard and carved from stone. Colorless, compressed lips suggested willpower, and his fixed gaze suggested a man accustomed to commanding. With a look and a gesture, he ordered everyone from the room. The resident slipped respectfully out the rear door, but the narrator remained standing at the head of the bed. A second, more forceful gesture directed at him alone had no effect. The healer gave him a crushing look, and thereafter behaved as though he did not exist. The man took a vessel of water, murmured words the narrator could not understand, and sprinkled the water in a circle around the patient's bed, while continuing to recite formulas. Throughout the ceremony, he maintained an air of dignity and deliberate control, and scarcely looked at the sick man. The skeptical narrator found the scene infuriating. The healer then sat cross-legged on the floor before the bed. A deep seriousness came over his face. From his clothing he drew a very worn, greasy book, apparently a Koran, bowed low, and began praying in a monotonous voice. Gradually he became more animated, his body straightened, and his speech grew more intense. Looking upward, sometimes folding his hands, sometimes stretching them toward heaven, and sometimes crossing his arms over his chest, he prayed fervently to God. After a long period of silent prayer with head and body bowed, he finally rose. The strained expression had vanished, and his features appeared transfigured. In a sudden movement, he went to the patient's bedside, bent over the wound, blew upon it several times, and lightly stroked it with his right hand. Then he straightened, his face resumed its ordinary hard expression, and he left as silently as he had come, pausing only to cast the narrator a look of contempt. The narrator turned back to his friend and was astonished. He had already noticed improvement during the ritual, but now the man appeared almost healthy. His eyes were calm, the fever had disappeared, and a contented smile lay on his face. "I feel quite well now. Give me a little more tea," he said in a quiet but steady voice. Soon afterward he fell into a deep, natural sleep. The narrator eventually had to leave, because duty called. He entrusted the recovering man to the local residents. By then the stars had disappeared, darkness covered the land, and thick mist lay over the rice fields. He says he spent the entire journey home thinking about his friend's extraordinary recovery, and arrived almost dazed. That evening he went to the friend's home, intending to tell the wife gently about the accident. To his amazement, he found the man himself sitting in an armchair on the veranda. The friend laughed at his astonishment and waved, as though to prove he was no hallucination. He remained weak, but his solid constitution suggested a rapid return of strength. 2 days later, the narrator was transferred elsewhere. At parting, the friend said, "You have now seen with your own eyes that these simple children of nature can sometimes do more than your scholars with all their book learning. The best European doctor could not have saved me from certain death. Yet, as you see, I recovered, though I myself do not understand how it was possible." The narrator admits that he did not understand it either. To him, the event remained a book sealed with 7 seals. The journal's editor comments that an occultist would classify such an account among prayer healings combined with healing magnetism and perhaps Kabbalistic practice. The editor argues that comparable methods had long existed in Europe, and regarded their presence in Java as evidence of the widespread distribution of mystical healing methods. He insists that materialistic scholars dislike such methods but have not succeeded in eliminating them because repeated practical successes continually renew popular confidence. The editor takes the opportunity to defend folk medicine and freedom of healing practice. A desperately ill person, he says, cares less about whether a method possesses an accepted theoretical explanation than whether it appears to work. He expresses the old polemical maxim that a patient would rather be made healthy unscientifically than be treated to death lege artis, according to all the rules of professional art. The persistence of folk practice, he argues, may have preserved remedies that otherwise would have vanished. Spirea ulmaria and Rabies, a historical report. As an example, Surya introduces the root of Spirea ulmaria, now generally known as meadowsweet, which in Volhynia was said to have been used as a folk remedy against hydrophobia. The following material is taken from a 19th century homeopathic materia medica and is reproduced here as a historical claim, not as modern medical guidance. The first medical report cited comes from Dr. Kunin, who practiced in a village in the Wereysk district of the Moscow government. In a pamphlet published in 1844, he described how he learned of the remedy. In 1832, Kunin wrote, "His own dog became rabid and bit him severely in several places on the hand. The dog was confined, refused food and drink, howled strangely, and died 3 days later, with what Kunin considered unmistakable symptoms of rabies." Knowing that the medical treatments then available against hydrophobia often failed, and having seen poor results himself, Kunin sent for a neighboring peasant who had acquired a local reputation through allegedly successful treatment of the disease. The farmer supplied fresh, finely cut roots and instructed Kunin to take a small amount on 3 successive mornings. 18 years later, Kunin wrote that he had experienced no consequences from the bite. Naturally interested in identifying the plant, he asked the farmer to show it to him. The plant was Spirea ulmaria. Kunin said that for the next 18 years he used the fresh root in numerous cases of bites by rabid dogs, and believed he obtained consistently successful results. He did not experiment with dried root. Rabid dogs were reportedly common in the district. Kunin kept a powerful yard dog, which he released against them. The dog killed the intruders, but was repeatedly wounded. After every such fight, Kunin says he gave the dog the fresh root, and the animal remained healthy for many years. Convinced by these experiences, Kunin recommended the remedy to acquaintances and friends, and reported hearing of similar success. He published the account because he believed a remedy for so terrible a disease deserved wider attention. A second edition of Kunin's pamphlet appeared after his death, with additions by a writer named Shibboleth. Among the cases was one from September 1850. A servant belonging to a neighboring landowner was brought to Kunin with what the account describes as fully developed hydrophobia. 2 strong men restrained him because he repeatedly attempted to attack them. His gaze was dull and fixed. Uncertain whether the root could still have any effect at such an advanced stage, Kunin ordered fresh roots brought immediately. After they were cleaned and washed, the patient seized the first root and swallowed it with what the narrator describes as animal greed. He consumed a second just as rapidly, and half of a third. Afterward, at Kunin's signal, the attendants released him. The dull expression had disappeared, and he was calmer. About 15 minutes later, he exclaimed with effort, "Oh, how grateful I am to you." He was taken by wagon to his village, about 5 versts away, and slept the entire journey. Still asleep on arrival, he was allowed to remain in the wagon until evening. When he finally woke, the account says, he became agitated and cried that he must die. He then vomited large quantities of bile, some liquid and some in dark green masses, but to the observer's surprise, without visible fragments of the roots. Deep sleep followed again. The next morning, he awoke reportedly recovered. Kunen was so impressed that he tried the plant on a girl who had suffered from epilepsy since childhood. For a week before an expected seizure, he gave her a strong decoction of the root. The next attack was said to be less severe. The attack expected the following month did not occur, though she felt unwell and restless. Instead of the third expected seizure, she slept, and the fourth reportedly never appeared. Kunen described her as thereafter recovered. Asked whether he had ever seen spirea fail when used against hydrophobia or prophylactically after bites, Kunen answered no. He claimed that neither he nor people who used it on his recommendation had observed a failure. Surya then cites another physician, Stanislaus Melzinowicz, employed at a cotton spinning establishment in the same Russian region. In 1846, Melzinowicz reported 6 groups of cases involving people said to have been bitten by rabid dogs, wolves, or horses. In one case from 1842, a peasant named Paul Ivanov was attacked by a rabid wolf and suffered 12 deep wounds to hands and head, including destruction of the left eye. After prolonged treatment with spirea, the report says, he recovered. The wolf was killed after attacking 2 horses, and the account says both horses later developed rabies. A second peasant, Terenti Sacharov, was bitten by a wolf on the lower lip and right upper eyelid. He refused the physician's treatment and went instead to other healers. 29 days after the bite, he died, with symptoms described as full hydrophobia. The report emphasizes that he had not received spirea. In May 1845, 3 shepherds and 19 head of livestock were reportedly wounded by another wolf. 11 animals died, with symptoms considered rabid, while the 3 shepherds and 8 animals treated with spirea were said to recover. Another peasant was bitten by a horse that itself had supposedly become rabid after a wolf bite. The man received the plant and recovered, while the horse was confined, observed, and died with the reported symptoms of rabies. A 16-year-old gardener named Vladimir Ivanov was badly bitten on the left hand by a hunting dog on September 1, 1846. After 6 weeks of the plant treatment, he was described as fully recovered. Melzinowicz also claimed to have experimented on dogs by confining animals believed to be rabid and treating some, but not others. According to his report, the untreated dogs died, while the treated dogs recovered. The article then reproduces Melzinowicz's historical treatment protocol in considerable detail. It involved washing bite wounds with vinegar prepared from the root, applying compresses soaked in the same preparation, rubbing the body with it, administering pressed fresh root juice and chopped root for about 6 weeks, and increasing the amount after the 13th day. The source also recommends an irritant blistering procedure along the spine if dreams of attacking rabid animals appeared around the 4th week, interpreting such dreams as a warning sign of imminent hydrophobia. The editor adds an occult numerological note about the 28th day, emphasizing its divisibility by 7, and quoting writers who believed disease crises often followed 7-day cycles. A further editorial note speculates that other counter-irritation techniques might substitute for the plant if it were unavailable. These 19th-century claims long predate modern understanding of rabies and should be read only as historical evidence of medical and occult belief. The article itself continues in a later installment beyond this extract. Occult Review improved, Spectora screens? The journal returns to reports concerning Dr. Patrick O'Donnell of Chicago, who had allegedly attempted to photograph the soul, or life principle, at the instant of death in Mercy Hospital. A notice quoted from the Berliner Tageblatt described O'Donnell as a researcher into a radiant human fluid, said to be an electrical form of light surrounding the body. According to the report, O'Donnell demonstrated this supposed radiation to Chicago physicians by having them look through specially prepared glass plates containing a chemical mixture. Through the plates, observers claimed that a luminous halo around those present became visible. O'Donnell himself stopped short of declaring the radiation to be the soul. He instead called it a mysterious radioactive force which could be perceived through suitably treated material. The journal notes that American newspapers treated his experiments at length and that other physicians were said to have reported similar observations. The re-emergence of Atlantis. The journal next reproduces a sensational newspaper story claiming that an American deep-sea expedition had found evidence that a vast portion of the Atlantic seafloor was rising. The article named 2 supposed Harvard investigators and asserted that an area comparable in size to Germany, Austria, and France combined had risen until the water above it was only a few hundred meters deep rather than several thousand. The report interpreted the alleged uplift as the beginning of the reappearance of Atlantis. It also claimed that unusually strong Gulf Stream currents had been redirected toward Western Europe, and speculated about dramatic future changes in climate, economics, transportation, and politics. The occult commentator connected the story with predictions attributed to H.P. Blavatsky and Annie Besant, and even indulged in speculation about a future struggle among world powers. This item is presented in the journal as contemporary occult news. Its geological claims should not be mistaken for established science. Thorium X. Newspaper reports from a Congress of Internal Medicine described experiments by the clinicians Krauss of Berlin and von Norden of Vienna, with the intensely radioactive preparation then called Thorium X. The reports claimed effects on white blood cells, blood pressure, metabolism, respiration, and heart activity, and discussed its possible use in leukemia and anemia. The occult editor uses the report rhetorically. If modern physicians could discover substances whose effects seemed almost miraculous, he asks, why should one dismiss the possibility that old alchemical physicians had possessed preparations whose effects likewise appeared inexplicable in their own time? The comparison reflects the journal's recurring attempt to reinterpret older occult traditions through the language of emerging science. The divining rod in Southwest Africa. Experiments in German Southwest Africa using a divining rod to locate underground water were reported as complete. The Dowser von Uslar had indicated sites for drilling, and the journal states that water was found in 83% of the locations he marked. It calls this the most favorable result yet reported for the method. The divining rod and a buried tomb. A second notice tells of a resident of Neuzelle who claimed that his divining rod indicated metal 5 or 6 meters underground near a church. Excavation reportedly uncovered a burial chamber containing a coffin, an embalmed body dressed in red velvet, numerous gilded metal ornaments and medals, and a large bronze plaque. Enough of the inscription remained to identify the deceased as a lieutenant general and commander of the fortress of Magdeburg, who lived from 1660 to 1713. The find was said to have been transferred to the Municipal Museum at Guben. The spirit of W.T. Stead. A Vienna newspaper reported that during a meeting of the Society for Psychical Research in June 1912, it was announced that W.T. Stead had allegedly manifested after his death on the Titanic in connection with the Bureau Julia he had founded. A member of the Serbian legation claimed to have seen Stead's face distinctly in 3 seances. What convinced him most strongly, according to the report, was an occasion on which the supposed apparition spoke to a Croatian friend newly arrived in London in that friend's own language. Anton the Healer. A brief notice from Gemapes, Belgium, reports the death at the end of June of the well-known wonder worker called Anton the Healer. He was 66 years old. A contribution to number mysticism. The journal offers the life dates of the Danish king Frederick VIII as an example of numerical mysticism. By repeatedly adding, subtracting and reducing the numbers contained in his birth, accession, and death dates, the writer obtains the year 1863, a year regarded as fateful in Danish history because of the political crisis that preceded the conflict with Prussia and Austria. The editor rejects the easy answer that such correspondences are merely coincidence, arguing that calling something chance does not explain why the coincidence occurred. The calculation is of interest mainly as an example of the style of numerological reasoning common in occult periodicals of the period. The end of a haunted villa. A villa near Allenstein associated with a notorious murder case was reportedly demolished and replaced by another building. The old house had acquired a reputation for haunting. Among the stories repeated in the press was the claim of two women that on an anniversary of the murder, they heard a gunshot in the house, although no visible cause could be found. Can we see into the future? Camille Flammarion is cited for a case originally connected with Dr. Ambroise Auguste Lebal. A young man had visited a fortune-teller, Madame Lenormand, in December 1879. She allegedly predicted that his father would die after roughly a year, that his own military service would be brief, that he would marry and have 2 children, and that he himself would die in his 27th year. According to the account, several of the predictions seemed to come true. The father died near the date indicated, the young man's military service lasted only a few months, and he later married and became the father of 2 children. As his predicted death approached, however, he became terrified. Lebal tried to relieve the fear by placing him in a hypnotic or somnambulistic state, and giving him the counter-suggestion that he would live many more years. The reassurance calmed the patient, but the account says that he nevertheless died in September 1886, during the very year foretold by the fortune-teller. The journal presents the case as evidence worthy of consideration in the study of prediction, suggestion, and the possible perception of future events. Are there true dreams? A former member of the Austrian Reichsrat, describing himself as skeptical by temperament, recounts a dream that led him to keep written records of unusual dreams. He dreamed that his elderly mother-in-law lay in bed, groaning. A man entered, listened to her breathing, and declared that her end had come. Several years later, he says, a scene occurred in waking life that reproduced the dream with striking fidelity. His mother-in-law was dying in the same position, and a physician entered and made essentially the same judgment he remembered from the dream. Because the dream had been recorded long before the event, the writer felt unable to dismiss the resemblance as a false memory constructed afterward. He acknowledges the skeptical objection that among the enormous number of dreams, some must occasionally resemble later events by chance. Yet he believes the detailed correspondence in his own case was sufficiently strong to make the question of precognitive dreams worth investigating. Telepathy? A university student in Munster supplies 2 small incidents. While opening a letter, he spontaneously used the unusual word exquisite. A short time later, his landlady, without knowing what he had said, independently used the same uncommon expression. The coincidence impressed him because the word was not part of their ordinary conversation. In another incident, he strongly wished that a 14-year-old boy named Karl would return. He concentrated on the thought of calling him, but according to the account, did not speak aloud. The boy soon appeared, and said he had distinctly heard the student calling Karl. The editor interprets the incident not only as possible telepathy, but also as an example of the concentrated will producing an effect outside ordinary speech. An odic magnetic relation between human beings and plants? From Bermansdorf comes a folk custom in which a pear tree was planted for a boy and an apple tree for a girl, so that the tree became symbolically connected with the child's life. One girl named Rosa later died from lung disease. Her associated tree, the story says, declined and remained unhealthy for years afterward. The correspondent wonders whether such traditions preserve an idea of an astral or magnetic bond between a person and a plant. Fear of death and white hair. A newspaper report from Brussels tells of a diver whose arm became trapped underwater for many hours. He survived, but lost the arm, and the report claims that the terror and pain of the ordeal turned his hair completely white. The journal cites the story in support of the old belief that extreme shock can rapidly alter the color of the hair. Remarkable magnetic healings. A contributor named Father Janssen gives several personal anecdotes in which he believed magnetic treatment had relieved serious medical emergencies, including a strangulated hernia and severe bleeding. He also describes episodes involving childbirth and menstrual hemorrhage in which he believed concentrated magnetic influence produced an immediate improvement. These are historical claims from 1912, not medical instructions. The cases illustrate the periodical's conviction that animal magnetism might act directly upon bodily processes which conventional medicine could not always control. The witch craze of the Middle Ages. A long notice reflects on the persecution of alleged witches. Even while leaving open the occultists' belief that genuine magical practitioners might have existed, the writer argues that the witch persecutions destroyed enormous numbers of innocent people. In his view, even if one genuine witch were granted for the sake of argument, at least 1,000 innocent victims were likely to have suffered alongside that person. The article cites Bamberg as an especially grim example. A special witch house was constructed there in 1625 during the rule of the prince-bishop's authorities. The writer says that roughly 900 trials took place in the following years, and quotes an old pamphlet asserting that hundreds were burned. Torture could continue for months, property was confiscated, and accusation reached far beyond the poor. Officials, clergy, mayors, artisans, women, and even very young girls were swept into the prosecutions. One surviving document is said to list 33 prisoners in 1631. The article emphasizes cases in which children were executed, and tells of an elderly woman who died under torture and was afterward officially declared innocent, her husband receiving a certificate to that effect. The bitter irony of such posthumous vindication is used to condemn the machinery of accusation and torture. A message from beyond. A report attributed to the Daily Telegraph describes a spiritualist message supposedly received soon after the Titanic disaster and addressed to President William Howard Taft. The communicator identified himself as Major Archibald Butt, the president's military aide, who died in the sinking. According to the account, the message was received through a woman identified as Frau von Meissner, before the rescue ship Carpathia had made full contact with the outside world. The supposed communicator described a sudden transition into another state of existence, and spoke of having helped terrified people in the disaster. W.T. Stead, also lost on the Titanic, was said to have acted as an intermediary, and a message attributed to Mrs. Isidor Strauss was also mentioned. The journal reproduces the story as a spiritualist claim, and does not provide independent evidence for it. Mailbox. A comment on Staudenmaier. G.W. Surya comments on Dr. Staudenmaier's experimental theory of hallucinations and personifications. Surya accepts that many of Staudenmaier's experiences could arise from parts of his own unconscious. Yet he doubts that this explanation necessarily covers every hostile or apparently independent manifestation. From a spiritist or traditional occult standpoint, Surya argues, some such appearances might instead be interpreted as spirits, demons, elementals, or other independent intelligences. He therefore regards Staudenmaier's work as especially valuable because it stands at the border between psychological and occult interpretations. He also suggests that Staudenmaier possessed an unusually strong natural capacity for magical phenomena, and wonders whether experiments in thought photography and related fields might have produced further results under knowledgeable guidance. Psychological investigations. A practical physician's comparison of palmistry and a birth horoscope. The journal prints a technical case study attempting to correlate the lines and mounts of a man's hands with the planetary relationships in his astrological birth chart. The subject had been sickly in youth. His life and headlines were described as partly merged and broken, while the right hand, interpreted as the expression of active and positive forces, appeared stronger than the left. The writer matches particular breaks, branches, mounts, and changes in the hand with Saturn, Mercury, Sun, and other astrological factors. He interprets the stronger right hand as evidence that the subject overcame the weakness of youth through energy and effort. A pronounced Mercury region is associated with persistent thought and mental restlessness. Branching in lines assigned to Saturn is read as a later sharpening of rational and philosophical power. The author also tries to connect periods marked on the hand with primary astrological directions occurring at similar ages. Certain signs are interpreted as warnings that excessive intellectual activity might disturb digestion or nervous health, while later sun-related lines are taken to suggest that intuition or a more cosmic mode of understanding might become stronger with age. Because the old printed page contains numerous planetary glyphs that the scan does not reproduce reliably in OCR, the formula-like calculations are not useful in an audiobook. The essential conclusion is clear. The author believes the traditional planetary descriptions used in palmistry possess genuine astrological significance because the two systems appeared to yield parallel judgments in this case. From the book table, The Occult Causes of Disease, a commentary on Paracelsus. The journal reviews E. Wolfram's book on the Volumen Paramirum of Paracelsus. The reviewer argues that Paracelsus intentionally wrote in a difficult symbolic vocabulary comprehensible only to trained students of esoteric doctrine. Wolfram's book is praised for translating that symbolic medical language into a form a modern occult reader could understand. The 5 causes of disease attributed to Paracelsus are summarized as ens naturale, ens astrale, ens veneni, ens spirituale, and ens dile. The reviewer interprets them as disease arising from natural and climatic influences or infection, from poisons taken in through food, breath, and perception, from bodily disposition present at birth, from magic or spiritual influence, and from divine or karmic causes. Wolfram also adds his own occult social speculations. Epidemics are described as diseases of a group soul, supposedly affecting peoples in whom collective rather than individual life predominates. Modern Europeans, by contrast, are said to suffer more individualized nervous disorders because strongly developed personalities have separated themselves from harmonizing group forces without yet gaining full mastery over their own psychological organization. Nietzsche and Kant are mentioned as examples of highly developed individuality accompanied by frailty. The reviewer strongly recommends the book as an important attempt to bring Paracelsus closer to contemporary occult readers. World Religion and Our Near Future, Annie Besant. A second review concerns lectures Annie Besant delivered in London in 1911. Besant argues that history proceeds in recurring periods and that new stages of civilization are announced by great religious teachers. Just as the seasons recur, she says, a prophet or world teacher appears at the dawn of a new cultural epoch. The review connects these expectations with the Order of the Star in the East, founded at Benares in January 1911, with Besant as protector and the young J. Krishnamurti as its principal representative. The reviewer notes that a deep longing for renewed religious revelation seemed to be moving through contemporary culture. Materialism, in his judgment, had exhausted itself, while institutional Christianity no longer satisfied the intellectual and spiritual hunger of many people. Whether Krishnamurti was actually the expected world teacher, however, the reviewer refuses to decide. The sensible attitude, he says, is to wait and observe his development. If he were genuinely chosen for such a role, no worldly power could ultimately prevent him from fulfilling it. If he were not, no organization could manufacture a prophet by declaration. The writer also doubts that a future teacher would surpass Christ unless Christ himself returned. Occult Science in India and Among the Ancients. Louis Jacqueliot. Wilhelm Wrchovszky reviews an English translation of Louis Jacqueliot's writings on Indian occultism, mystical initiation, and spiritism. Jacqueliot had been cited by H. P. Blavatsky, Karl Duprel, Albert de Rochas, Gustav Meyrink, and others, and his accounts were often invoked as evidence for extraordinary performances by yogis, including levitation and apport phenomena. Wrchovszky nevertheless emphasizes that Jacqueliot's reliability had long been questioned. Professor Julian Vinson had criticized him decades earlier, and Annie Besant had described him to the reviewer as quite unreliable. Wrchovszky also criticizes the extravagant use later writers had made of Jacqueliot, including attempts to construct a history of Christianity from his material. Even so, he welcomes the translation of what he considers Jacqueliot's most useful occult work. The book is stimulating and interesting, he says, though he wishes the translator had replaced Jacqueliot's fanciful transcriptions of Sanskrit words with correct forms. His verdict is cautious. The book merits attentive study, but its spectacular claims should not be accepted uncritically. Attempts to Establish a Scientific Experimental Magic by Dr. L. Staudenmaier. Conclusion. Staudenmaier returns to the idea that magical phenomena can be encouraged by putting both the conscious mind and the relevant regions of the unconscious into a particular mood. A person might contemplate a collection of paintings, the starry sky, or a piece of music, and then allow the associated thoughts and reveries to arise, without forcibly holding to any single idea. The magician differs from the painter, astronomer, or musician because the ultimate aim is not art, astronomy, or music itself, but the attempt to see and hear the experienced material again, to reproduce it hallucinatorily in visual and auditory form. He believes that illness and other bodily stresses can sometimes increase nervous activity so intensely that unusual creative or magical capacities appear. If the condition persists, the heightened capacity itself can become pathological. This, he suggests, may help explain why genius has sometimes been mistaken for a disease in itself. He recalls reading that Schiller produced the Wallenstein trilogy while mortally ill, and remarks on the extraordinary fact that a dying man could wrest so great a work from the edge of death. Hunger and thirst provide another model. People wandering in deserts sometimes report visions of food, flowing water, and lush landscapes. Such hallucinations can be beautiful and convincing, complete with imagined taste and smell. Staudenmaier compares them with his own visual hallucinations, which he says are often artistically beautiful, vividly alive, and original combinations rather than simple copies of things previously seen. At other times they are grotesque, mocking, or ugly. He claims the same richness for his musical hallucinations and for imagined foods and drinks. The unconscious as a community of partial beings. Staudenmaier now argues that the ordinary terms the subconscious and the unconscious are inadequate for his experience. He does not encounter one single hidden mind standing opposite the waking self. Rather, his unconscious has, in his interpretation, differentiated into numerous partial beings, each with its own memory, interests, habits, and tendencies. He thinks some tendency in this direction exists in everyone. Certain nervous centers or groups of cells may be more intelligent, more developed, or better placed than others, and they try to influence neighboring regions and even the conscious ego. Under ordinary conditions, these centers never develop into distinct personalities, because the waking self governs too strongly and gives them little opportunity to speak. Yet even during intense conscious thought, he says, not every part of the brain is occupied in the same way. Some regions may therefore continue their own associative activity in the background, especially during reverie. For years, in order to find a scientific point of attack on magic, he deliberately cultivated this autonomous activity, rather than relying only on conscious acts of will. The result, he says, was the formation of pronounced personifications. Whatever their ultimate explanation, he must deal with them as experiential facts. Their development has caused serious difficulties, but he also believes it has given him advantages. Because individual personifications can speak internally, he can question them about the bodily regions or mental functions with which they are associated. He considers this easier than trying to communicate with a vague and undifferentiated unconscious through obscure feelings alone. Some personifications, he says, have had beneficial effects. One that he calls the child has increased his interest in childish play, naive behavior, harmless joy, and even toys. He regards this as refreshing and rejuvenating for an aging mind increasingly dominated by rational work. Other personifications have deepened his appreciation of art. He notes the irony that he himself had once cared little for ancient and medieval art, while certain internal personifications seemed passionately attracted to it and repeatedly pushed him toward it. This leads him to criticize contemporary estimates of the unconscious as too dismissive. People often know the unconscious chiefly through dreams, which can contain absurd mixtures. But in sleep, he argues, the waking self is just as limited as the unconscious, because large networks of associations are unavailable. Dream nonsense should therefore not automatically be blamed on the unconscious alone. He intervenes against his personifications when their activity becomes too strong, when their images threaten to become compulsive, or when tendencies appear that he regards as immoral, dangerous, or destructive of the unity of the personality. Unfortunate combinations can arise, he says, producing internal figures that behave like mischievous boys or even devilish beings. In his model, large areas of the unconscious can degenerate just as the conscious personality can. The devilish within. Staudenmaier develops this argument with a reversal of Goethe. Goethe had written that if the eye were not sunlike, it could not behold the sun, and if divine power did not lie within us, we could not be delighted by the divine. By analogy, Staudenmaier says if there were nothing devilish in us, how could we perceive what is devilish and recoil from it? The personifications corresponding to such tendencies can be intelligent in a narrow way, he says, yet lack concern for the welfare of the organism as a whole. They eagerly imitate harmful or degrading material encountered in the outside world. He describes them as possessing a special sensitivity to what is ugly or cruel and taking pleasure in reproducing it. In religious language, such experiences might easily have been interpreted as attacks by demons. For Staudenmaier, however, the more economical explanation is internal. He proposes that reports by ascetics and mystics of tormenting demons may sometimes reflect hostile personifications produced within the person's own psychophysical organization. A voice that declares, in effect, that torment itself is pleasure may be an autonomous-seeming expression of a nervous complex pursuing its own narrow excitation without understanding the suffering of the whole person. He repeatedly stresses that intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. A partial being can be clever within its own restricted field and still be foolish, destructive, or morally blind when viewed from the standpoint of the complete organism. How a personification is built. Staudenmaier illustrates his theory with the figure he calls Highness. A king or emperor is not represented in the mind by visual appearance alone. Such a figure also evokes a particular complex of feelings: dignity, rank, grandeur, authority, distance, solemnity, and the bodily sensations associated with them. According to Staudenmaier, the nervous centers most strongly connected with these feelings become the leading group when the personification of Highness appears. Over time, he says, these centers gained influence over other cell groups and even over muscular expression, allowing the personification to make itself felt more strongly. Other personifications similarly organize themselves around different specialized centers. He compares the process to a musical ensemble in which one group temporarily takes the lead while other parts support it. The specialized centers nevertheless have narrower limits than the conscious ego. A low musical string can be tightened enough to produce a somewhat higher note, and a high string loosened enough to produce a lower one, but only within limits. In the same way, his child normally speaks with a child's voice. When he asked why it did so, although it was not literally a child, the answer was initially, "We must speak like a child. We cannot do otherwise." Later, as the personification became more articulate, it explained that using another voice felt difficult and unattractive and would make it harder for him to recognize which internal group was speaking. Staudenmaier therefore describes the personifications as partial beings held within a particular suggestion or confined by preference to a narrow chain of ideas. The body as part of the psychic system. His experiments lead him to imagine the human psyche not as a simple unity, but as a hierarchy of centers with very different functions and degrees of importance. He asks why different centers should have different psychological functions. Structure, position in the brain, and habit are part of the answer, but he believes their connections with peripheral organs are equally important. Some of his personifications, he says, seem to exert unusually strong influence over organs that are not normally subject to voluntary control. If such a personification becomes disordered, it can misuse that influence and resist his efforts to restrain it. For ordinary sensations, the relation between central nervous processing and peripheral organs is obvious. Sight involves the eyes, hearing the ears, sexual sensation the sexual organs, and hunger and thirst the mouth and stomach. Staudenmaier extends the same idea, speculatively, to complex emotions. Based partly on what his personifications tell him, he locates the peripheral component of feelings of majesty in the stomach region, sublime feelings around the upper intestinal or solar plexus region, and what he calls base or devilish impulses lower in the intestinal tract. He even uses this scheme to explain the traditional association of demons with foul smells and animal features. He says that when personifications connected with digestion become excessively developed, unnatural tensions or inhibitions can arise in the gastrointestinal tract. He pictures these as territorial boundaries between competing internal groups. Because he had suffered from nervous digestive problems for more than 30 years, he considered it understandable that centers associated with the digestive system had become especially prominent in his experiments. He describes using ordinary changes of attention and bodily activity to interrupt such internal conflicts. By thinking vigorously about other subjects or engaging in physical exercise, he tries to change the overall nervous situation and deprive the troublesome centers of the conditions needed for elaborate internal activity. Hunger, thirst, and magical eating. Prolonged lack of food or drink, he says, begins with the ordinary bodily sensations of hunger and thirst. These sensations then stimulate related ideas. If the excitation spreads strongly enough through the nervous system, the ideas can become vivid visual hallucinations of food and drink. Taste and smell may follow. In the most extreme case, a person can seem subjectively to eat and drink hallucinatory objects. For Staudenmaier, this sequence is a model of magic. Bodily excitation promotes an associated idea. The idea spreads into increasingly broad sensory networks. And finally, the representation becomes so intense that it is experienced as an external perception. He concludes that experiments aimed at reproducing food or drink hallucinatorily would be most likely to succeed when the corresponding bodily sensations were already active. He generalizes the principle. If one wishes to produce a particular class of phenomenon, one should arrange conditions that favor the corresponding emotional and sensory system. Why seances favor darkness? Staudenmaier applies the same reasoning to spiritualist seances. Spiritualists commonly meet in the evening or in dim rooms because, he says, it is easier under such conditions to produce a spirit mood. Darkness reduces competing sensory impressions and can facilitate inward imagery. Unfortunately, the same darkness also makes fraud easier, which has damaged the reputation of spiritualism. Mediums often enter hypnotic sleep, he notes. In such a condition, the relevant unconscious processes are less disturbed by the waking ego and its forceful ideas. Especially predisposed individuals may not require sleep, and some phenomena are reported even in daylight. Peripheral bodily stimulation can also contribute. To investigate fear, Staudenmaier deliberately placed himself in circumstances designed to create it. After dusk, in cold, windy, rainy weather, he wandered through wooded and marshy country beside a loud river while intentionally recalling robber stories and ghost tales he had read. After only a few trials, he says, an abnormal fear, unlike anything he had previously known, began to seize him. Ideas became increasingly vivid. Then, illusions and hallucinations followed. Wind-blown branches looked like murderous hands reaching for him. Threatening forms seemed to approach with drawn knives, and dark figures appeared to lie in wait. The effect became so unpleasant that he abandoned this line of experimentation rather than develop what he calls this particular form of mediumship any further. Spirits are personifications. The experiment supports his central warning about spiritistic interpretation. Consciousness can split so extensively, he argues, that hallucinations and personifications behave toward the individual like hostile enemies. Spiritualists may take such hostility as proof that an independent evil spirit is present. Staudenmaier considers that conclusion unjustified. The characteristic error of a personification, in his theory, is that it takes itself literally for the thing it represents. A personification organized around the image of a dead person may genuinely believe itself to be that dead person. Its speech and conduct will then follow the role. The sitter makes the reciprocal error. Because the apparition behaves like the dead father, mother, spouse, or friend, the sitter assumes that it truly is that spirit. Staudenmaier insists that even a benevolent apparition that reproduces familiar behavior should not be accepted without criticism. If the figure is an internal personification, it need not be consciously lying. It may be sincerely mistaken about its own identity. Thus, in his view, both medium and manifestation can participate in the same misunderstanding. Specific stimuli and specific images. Specific bodily stimuli tend to call forth specific ideas, Staudenmaier continues. Dreams provide familiar examples. Strong excitation of one bodily system may produce dreams and hallucinations of the corresponding kind. If the excitation becomes abnormal, similar imagery may intrude even into the waking state. Different sensory and bodily systems can also be excited simultaneously, producing fantastic combinations. Strange composite beings may therefore emerge in hallucination without requiring the existence of corresponding creatures in the external world. In pathological conditions, if a particular organ or nervous center remains chronically overexcited, the associated ideas may become persistent compulsions. Staudenmaier says that understanding where he believes the relevant bodily component lies is important for interrupting his own intrusive hallucinations. He mentions changes of posture and other physical or psychophysical means by which he attempts to alter the spread of excitation. He promises a fuller discussion elsewhere. A psychic interpretation of the human organism. To reproduce a purely visual hallucination, Staudenmaier says the entire visual system must be brought into intense activity, ultimately including the peripheral visual apparatus. To reproduce a majestic personality realistically, however, visual excitation alone is insufficient. The complex of bodily sensations associated with dignity and grandeur must also be activated. Otherwise, he may obtain the appearance of the person without the distinctive feeling of majesty. The more complex an idea, therefore, the more extensive the cooperation required among cortical regions, subordinate centers, and peripheral nerves. This very extension of excitation, he says, strengthens memory and representation. The real world first acts upon us through the eyes, ears, skin, and other peripheral organs. When an internally generated representation recruits the same pathways, it becomes increasingly detailed and lifelike. He therefore proposes the provocative formula that the seat of magical memory and magical imagination is the whole body. Not the cerebral cortex alone. Numerous organs and nerve endings distributed through the body acquire psychological significance within this theory. The more vivid the memory, the larger the psychophysical system participating in it. Staudenmaier uses the heart as an example. A mechanistic physiologist might regard it chiefly as a pump, yet emotions clearly affect its nervous regulation. That does not mean the heart independently thinks. Rather, it demonstrates that mental states and peripheral organs form connected systems. He believes magical representation exaggerates these normally subtle connections until they become easier to observe. The psychic and psychophysical development of the unconscious. Because his personifications display varying degrees of intelligence, Staudenmaier believes they can be educated further. He does not wish to develop them into full human intelligences. To do so, he jokes, would make the conscious self unnecessary. But if they can learn to speak, and sometimes give useful advice within their specialties, he sees no reason why all development must stop there. The conscious ego, he says, is broadly developed, but often highly specialized. His personifications are also highly developed in narrow fields, while remaining naive in others. Genius and foolishness can therefore coexist in the same partial being. He attributes this unevenness to years of isolated development without communication or instruction between conscious and unconscious regions. His first educational task is to correct what he sees as their fundamental error, confusing representation with reality. He repeatedly tries to teach them that they belong to one organism, and that the welfare of the whole takes priority over the interests of an individual center. This is not easy, because hallucinations and personifications can be accompanied by pleasurable sensations. The unconscious centers may therefore be tempted to repeat them for their own gratification. Conversely, strong peripheral irritation may force the associated imagery upon the mind. Staudenmaier hopes to loosen the most intelligent centers from rigid dependence on their peripheral sources of pleasure, and attach them more closely to the conscious ego, giving them what he calls a wider outlook. He expects, however, that their specialized position will always leave them with stronger particular interests than those seen in the ordinary unified personality. Training through art, music, and attention. Another method is to treat magical production as a psychophysical exercise, or even as a stimulating game. Under supervision, the conscious self, the relevant unconscious centers, lower nervous centers, and peripheral organs temporarily cooperate as one system in producing a phenomenon. Art, music, and absorbing reading are especially useful, he says, because they expose narrowly specialized internal centers to broader and more valuable associations. The goal is not to teach a personification as one would teach an entirely separate child. These are, in his language, neighbors or subordinates within the brain. Training means opening pathways of association that were previously weak, unused, or inaccessible. If he looks at a painting with unusual concentration, the visual excitation spreads more widely through the brain. Cells normally occupied with other functions may be compelled, at least temporarily, to participate in seeing and appreciating the work. Repetition makes the pathway easier. Enjoyment can deepen, and more groups of cells can participate in a richer range of psychic activity. He reasons that ordinary visual perception already passes through numerous nerve cells before reaching conscious awareness. Stronger attention could therefore recruit still more cells in unconscious regions. His personifications, he says, prove that their associated centers can see and hear with great acuity. They sometimes reproduce a person or object he himself saw only once, with a fidelity he could not consciously achieve. The difficulty is not necessarily lack of sensory capacity, but lack of interest. Highness, for example, dislikes children's toys. If Staudenmaier stares at such an object until its representation spreads forcefully through the brain, Highness may experience it as an unpleasant compulsory idea. As a compromise, he sometimes gives the personification aristocratic children to reproduce, such as Van Dyck's portrait of the young son of Charles I of England. In this way, the unfamiliar subject is linked to a theme the personification already values. Concluding remarks. Staudenmaier believes magic will eventually become an important branch of experimental psychology. By deliberately producing unusual mental states while remaining awake and capable of self-observation, investigators may gain new insight into dreams, somnambulism, hypnosis, animal magnetism, mysticism, spiritism, and occultism generally. He even suggests that some nervous disorders, forms of insanity, and experiences historically described as possession might be studied experimentally through milder analogous processes within oneself. His claim is not that every such condition has one cause, but that controlled self-observation might reveal mechanisms hidden in ordinary consciousness. He likewise expects magic to contribute to the study of religion. Many religions, he says, were founded by people who would once have been called magicians or wonder workers. He considers Buddhism a kind of experimental religion, and complains that it had been studied mainly by theologians, philologists, Orientalists, and historians. That is to him like writing a history of chemistry without practical knowledge of chemistry. A historian of such phenomena should also understand their experiential techniques. Magic, in his view, can illuminate ordinary psychology precisely because it magnifies subtle processes. In normal life, many psychophysical events pass quietly and almost unnoticed, often in regions inaccessible to introspection. Magical practice, as he conceives it, drives them toward extremes, and may even project their contents outward as hallucinations. What is ordinarily invisible to observation then becomes conspicuous. The future human being. Staudenmaier also draws speculative conclusions about human evolution. Development, he thinks, will not concern the highest conscious centers alone. Lower brain centers may also become more differentiated and capable. He compares this with the development of a modern state in which education gradually reaches wider layers of the population. As those layers become more capable, they demand a greater role in the government of the whole. Human psychophysical evolution may therefore involve both stronger central organization and greater decentralization. The waking ego would not simply suppress all subordinate processes. Ideally, it would coordinate increasingly capable centers that participate more intelligently in the life of the organism. He acknowledges that the history of magic contains many reported phenomena he has not personally produced and cannot yet explain. His present purpose is only to find a scientific point of entry and analyze the simplest experiments first. More complicated claims should be postponed until the basic mechanisms are understood. Some feats attributed to exceptional magicians may also be unique, he says, just as the achievements of a great poet or musician cannot necessarily be reproduced by an ordinary person. The astral body and the double. One apparently mysterious spiritist idea, the astral body, seems comparatively simple to him. He interprets the supposed astral body, self-duplication, or doppelganger, as an outward magical projection of the idea of one's own personality. The unconscious can produce such a projection, and in principle, he thinks the conscious ego might learn to do so as well. He is willing to believe that many old reports of extraordinary magical phenomena contain a real core, even when they initially appear impossible. History, he reminds the reader, contains scientific discoveries in astronomy and physics that were first ridiculed. Yet he refuses to call the phenomena supernatural merely because they are strange. Until decisive evidence proves otherwise, he prefers to treat them as natural events arising from aspects of the organism that science does not yet understand. He explicitly concedes that Spiritism and Occultism have attracted fraud, superstition, and nonsense. For him, this does not settle the question, because fraud and superstition have accompanied every poorly understood field. He points to astrology and alchemy as historical mixtures of speculation, error, and observations that later fed astronomy and chemistry. A strong warning against experimentation. At this point, Staudenmaier issues one of the strongest warnings in the entire series. Readers should not begin experimenting with magic merely from what he has published. He says the practice has serious dangers, and that he has not yet given the detailed precautions developed through his own experience. He was already at an age when body and mind normally possess considerable stability, yet even after almost 10 years of practice, he sometimes found it difficult to maintain agreement with what he calls his neighbors in the brain. As a beginner, he had made serious mistakes and paid for them. Readers should not infer from the spectacular performances of unusually predisposed mediums that the production of major magical phenomena is easy. Even physically, such experiences can represent extreme exertion. He cites a report that the medium Elizabeth d'Esperance sometimes lost several kilograms of body weight after sittings and was completely exhausted. Staudenmaier says that when he himself overdid his early experiments, he sometimes had to remain lying down for long periods because he could scarcely move and all his limbs hurt. The psychological risks, he considers, are greater still. A solitary beginner is especially prone to excessive practice and may fail to limit experiments to fixed times. Once personifications have appeared, he says, those internal centers may themselves urge the experimenter to continue because their increased activity represents a kind of development from their own point of view. The conscious ego can then lose control of the process. He ends the warning with a stark observation. In his opinion, the number of people who had entered asylums after uncontrolled magical experimentation was frighteningly large. His article therefore cannot responsibly be read as a modern set of exercises. It is a historical record of Staudenmaier's own self-experimentation and of the psychological theory he built around it. Final outlook. Years of continual self-observation and internal dialogue, Staudenmaier says, eventually gave him new ideas about the psychophysical development of the human being. These ideas had begun to occupy him so strongly that his investigations were moving in new directions and leaving less time for what he calls magic proper, although the subjects remained closely connected. That shift is one reason he published this shortened account. He wanted to bring the first phase of his work to at least a provisional conclusion. He remains confident that magic, the last of the ancient arts, still stranded between superstition and contempt, will eventually be transformed into an orderly science. Astrology, he says, gave rise to astronomy. Alchemy gave rise to chemistry. He expects a comparable transformation for magic. The editor adds that readers interested in Staudenmaier's views can consult his expanded book, Die Magie als experimentelle Naturwissenschaft, Magic as an Experimental Natural Science, which develops the argument at much greater length. A Short Course in Physiognomy, by C. Translated from the French by Leah Firhow. Preface. Knowledge of human beings, the author begins, has always been considered one of the foundations of wisdom. In ordinary social life, we continually weigh another person's words, observe actions, listen to the voice, and watch facial expression in order to infer character. Feelings and thoughts become visible, as it were, in gesture, tone, expression, and speech. The author carries this familiar observation much farther. The body itself, not merely a passing facial expression, is said to be a plastic expression of personality. From that assumption arises physiognomy, the attempt to infer stable traits of character from outward bodily form and movement. The article insists that almost everyone already practices an informal physiognomy, but does so unsystematically and under the influence of prejudice and personal preference. A useful physiognomy, the author argues, would have to be organized like an empirical science, founded on repeated observation, comparison, and rational principles. A number of earlier writers are named, including Porta, Lavater, Gratelet, Duchenne, and Piderit. The system used in this course is said to depend especially on the work of Letos, whose classifications were based on traditional teaching and many years of observation. The theory begins with two broad classes of outward evidence, bodily and facial form on the one hand, and gesture or movement on the other. At first, the variety of human shapes and expressions appears endless. The author believes, however, that repeated observation reduces them to a limited set of basic forms from which more complicated appearances are composed. Temperament is said to govern the characteristic manner in which the organs and limbs move, while facial features and bodily lines give the more permanent structure. By combining form, contour, movement, and supposed temperament, the system claims to reconstruct the inner character. The basic types. The article says that lines of the face and body can be reduced to 8 fundamental forms. Their repetition in different parts of the body produces 8 basic physiognomic types traditionally associated with planetary or elemental names: Earth, Sun, Mars, Moon, Saturn, Mercury, Jupiter, and Venus. No actual person, the writer admits, is a perfectly pure example. Every individual contains all of the basic tendencies, with 2 or 3 usually predominating. A single overwhelmingly dominant type would produce an unusual or extreme character, while an equal mixture of many types would supposedly produce a contradictory or eccentric personality. The expression of any type is also said to vary with willpower, intelligence, and morality. Strong will is thought to make the features more compact, severe, firm, or angular. Intelligence is supposed to refine and harmonize them. Moral development is said to produce an attractive and harmonious expression, while bad character distorts the face. Yet, the author explicitly warns against simply equating physical unattractiveness with moral inferiority. In this system, an unaesthetic face and an immoral character are not considered the same thing. The first concerns the form of the features. The second is supposed to reveal itself through disharmony among them. Rather than describe an ideal saint and an extreme villain for every type, the course proposes to describe a middle form and let the reader imagine how its tendencies might be expressed constructively or destructively. The 8 types are also arranged into 2 opposing groups, described in the language of the period as predominantly masculine and predominantly feminine. A hierarchy is proposed among them, but the author again says this hierarchy should not be confused with moral value. A morally developed person of a supposedly lower type is to be valued above an immoral person of a supposedly higher one. The physical and psychological characteristics of each type are then meant to be presented in corresponding order, beginning with the body from head to foot, and then moving through intellect, character, emotional life, and physical tendencies. Illustrations accompanied the original article, but the author cautions that even the drawings can only approximate pure types because real people are mixtures. This system belongs to the historical tradition of physiognomy and is not accepted today as a scientific way to determine personality, morality, intelligence, or social worth from facial structure. The translation below preserves the article as a record of early 20th century occult thought, rather than endorsing its judgments. The Earth type physical description. The first type described is the Earth type. The article associates it with black, coarse, thick hair, and a forehead broader than it is high, narrowing toward the top and marked by folds or wrinkles. The brow ridges are described as prominent and bony, the eyebrows bushy and irregular, and the eyes as deep-set, sometimes reddish or green-gray with brown flecks. The gaze is characterized as hard, fixed, and cunning. The cheekbones are said to project strongly. The nose is blunt or straight but short, broad through the bridge, and squared at the base. The ear is described as irregular in form. The mouth is tightly closed, with marked corners and angular or heavy lips. Strong jaws and a projecting lower half of the face complete the facial scheme. The neck is imagined as thick and short, the shoulders broad and angular, and the body stocky, solid, hairy, and heavily built. The author's summary is that the type is square, bony, coarse, compact, and robust. These traits are said to become milder in intelligent or ethically developed individuals, and more exaggerated in people the author considers vicious. Women are described as showing the same supposed pattern less sharply. The original illustrations, the journal notes, also contain some influence from the Mars type, rather than representing a perfectly pure Earth type. Psychological description. The psychological portrait is much more sweeping. Earth-type people are described as attached to the soil, practical, narrow in outlook, and lacking what the author calls the synthetic or organizing mind. Philosophy and occult science supposedly hold little attraction for them. Fiction bores them because it is not literally true, and abstract artistic imagination is said to be weak. On the positive side, the article credits them with sharp senses, good observation, strong memory, practical judgment, and a large store of useful everyday knowledge. They are imagined as capable of weighing the concrete consequences of an action with care. What they supposedly lack is enthusiasm and intuition. Their attention remains fixed on what is tangible, useful, immediate, and materially advantageous. Religion, when present, is described by the author as either superstition or calculated devotion rather than inward mysticism. The article portrays them as advancing through life by patient attention to details, persistence, and shrewdness, rather than inspiration. Their mistrust of what cannot be directly observed is interpreted negatively as suspicion. Their humor is said to be coarse, their speech blunt, and their manner sometimes rough or awkward. At the same time, they are credited with firm and enduring willpower. Emotion, in this old typology, is strongly personal and practical. The writer claims that such people tend toward pessimism, criticism of others, curiosity about private affairs, irritability, and stubbornness. Love and marriage are described as being viewed materially, with practical advantage weighing heavily in the choice of a partner. Yet the portrait is not wholly hostile. The author says that beneath the hard exterior there may be a receptive emotional nature. Earth types can be grateful for benefits received and may be hospitable. They can become deeply loyal to a superior who has earned their confidence. Attachment to home makes them settled, and in wartime that same rootedness is said to make them courageous defenders of their country. Their fixity can also become selfishness, conservatism, acquisitiveness, and harsh defense of personal interests. The article associates them especially with physical labor and work connected with the earth. They are described as tough, enduring, and willing to perform difficult or unrewarding tasks with little rest. When the author imagines this type without moral restraint, the language becomes openly classist and dehumanizing, associating coarse physicality with criminality and bestial instinct. Women of the type are stereotyped as quarrelsome and gossiping, but also courageous, energetic, practical, and strict in raising children. These judgments reveal the prejudices built into historical, physiognomic systems, as much as they reveal anything about the people being classified. The author emphasizes again that real individuals are mixtures. Emile Zola is offered as an Earth type modified by Moon and Venus, Bismarck as modified by Jupiter and Mars, and Jules Gesda as modified by Saturn. The article claims the Earth type appears frequently among farmers, miners, servants, actors in softened form, and lower employees, a social classification that reflects the hierarchical assumptions of its era. Danton and Marat are identified as examples during the French Revolution. The article then attempts to diagnose whole European societies in the same manner, blaming an alleged predominance of the Earth type for literary realism, technological and mechanical development, materialism, greed, and what it sees as declining morals. At the same time, the author declares the type indispensable to a nation. Its endurance is said to support commerce, industry, agriculture, and military defense. The Boers are offered as a national example. The installment ends here with a notice that the course will continue. The Healing Power of Stones, Metals, and Amulets by Robert Blum. Beginning of the article. Robert Blum explains that questions from readers about healing stones, together with a request from the editors, prompted him to add further remarks to an earlier article titled Astral Body and Aura, Divining Rod and Talisman. His subject is the supposed interaction between physical and psychic forces in phenomena associated with stones, metals, amulets, auras, and talismans. To establish his framework, he repeats an occult evolutionary scheme used elsewhere in the journal. The phenomenal universe, he says, can be considered in terms of 7 categories of force and matter, together with consciousness. In a traditional formula, consciousness sleeps in the stone, dreams in the plant, stirs in the animal, and awakens to self-consciousness in man. The 4 lower categories are described as mechanical force, physical force, chemical force, and prana, or solar energy. These are called visible in the occult sense because their effects are accessible to physical perception and belong to the transient world. The upper 3 categories are named manas, buddhi, and atma. Their supposed subtle etheric substrates are described as invisible and imperishable. Blum cites Robertus de Fluctibus, Robert Flood, for a threefold division of the macrocosm. The upper region, the empyreum, corresponds to the higher principles. The lower elementary region corresponds to the more material forces. Between them lies the etherium, or astral region. All 3 are imagined as filled with celestial fire and penetrated by oceans of astral light, whose character changes with distance from the central spiritual sun. Planetary and astral influence. Each planet, according to Blum's occult cosmology, receives solar energy and sends it out again transformed as its own characteristic light. The planets are therefore connected continuously, not only with the Sun, but with one another, and are believed to exert mutual influence. Combined with solar influence, these planetary forces are said to participate in the formation and development of earthly things. Every stone, metal, plant, animal, and human being therefore stands, in Blum's scheme, under the dominant influence of one or more planets. The aura and etheric body of earthly objects are consequently imagined as combinations of prana, or solar matter, and planetary matter. Because both sun and planets are stars or astra in the older occult vocabulary, Blum calls this planetary substance astral matter. The etheric or astral body is then presented as the mediator between the visible elemental world and the higher celestial or astral forces believed to penetrate it. Mechanical, physical, chemical, and lower solar forces predominate in ordinary solid, liquid, and gaseous substances. As organisms become more complex, Blum says, additional and supposedly higher categories of force manifest themselves. In the human being, all seven are said to be represented. For that reason, occult writers call the human a microcosm, a small image of the greater universe. Quoting a conception associated with Eliphas Levi, Blum goes still further and calls the developed human being a god on earth, insofar as an adept who understood these forces would, in theory, be able to reproduce on the smaller scale many operations of the macrocosm. Just as the highest cosmic intelligence is imagined as acting through buddhi and manas upon prana and from there upon the elemental world, Blum proposes that the trained human spirit, through corresponding inner intelligences, might act downward upon subtler and then more physical forces.